When you read one of these books about local folklore, ghost stories, myths, have you ever wondered if the stories in them could be true? Tales of giants and ogres, fairies and goblins, all existing around small farming villages and retold for generations. Surely these are only stories. Metaphors, maybe, for the fears and uncertainties of a pre-industrial people. But it's often said that folk stories, no matter how strange they seem to us, all have some truth to them. Something which happened to start them off in the first place. We've probably all read stories like these, and we might find them amusing, fascinating, scary. But most of us go no further with them. We never think that the people and events featured in them are anything more than campfire stories. And even if there was some truth to them, surely it would be impossible to ever track them down. I've got a story here which was collected by the folklore collector Mary Leather. So she went around the villages basically interviewing the people that lived there about their beliefs and customs that she thought were going to fade away when the Industrial Revolution came along. And these are not fairy tales, they're folk stories. They were believed to be actually true, no matter how strange they were. They're basically records of belief and fading agricultural glory. No matter how strange they are, they were definitely believed by at least some people when they were first told. So this tale here, it's about a girl who vanishes into the fairyland, and she is eventually found, but it's a very, very strange tale. And it's been told again in a later book, which has added some more detail, including her name. And it's a very odd story, but I actually want to go further than just reading this. I want to know if it's true. I want to know if this girl actually existed, if I can find her in the records, and if she did exist, see if I can figure out what really happened to her. Before we begin though, it's of course impossible to track down a folk story without reading it first, so I've put together the original and later story, making the most complete but concise version of the tale that I could. This tale was first told to folklorist Mary Leather by a Mrs. W, aged 75 in 1909, and living in the village of Wigmore. It was first told to her from her mother, and allegedly happened to her mother's first cousin, a girl by the name of Mary Powell. When she was around 18, Mary loved dancing and would travel for miles to every ball and dance that she could find. Wherever a ball was held, there was Mary, dancing the night away. One night she had been dancing at a ball near to the town of Kington, and when coming home by the so-called dancing gates, she noticed a strange and beautiful music. It was the music of the fairies, and upon following it, she was caught into the fairy ring and spirited away into their world. When Mary did not return home, seemingly having vanished from the face of the earth, a search was made for her, with all the pathways between her hometown and Kington extensively searched, to no avail. Sometimes, villagers would report seeing her, but only for a moment or two, before she vanished again, like she was dissolving into thin air. Concerned by this, her mother visited a local wise man, Jeremiah Price, of whom knew straight away what had happened to poor Mary. "She's away with the fairies," he said, "but there is one way that you can save her." He told her mother to keep searching for her, and when she appears again to grab hold of her, but say not a word until Mary herself speaks, and this way she would be saved. This was because, according to the wise man, when Mary was thinking about home, she would temporarily appear there, the veils between worlds brought closer together. Mary's mother did as requested, and the next time the apparition of her daughter appeared, she tightly grabbed her and said not a word. Eventually Mary looked at her mother and calmly spoke. "Oh, mother," she said, "where have you been since yesterday?" Somehow it seemed, even though over a year had now passed since Mary vanished, she was convinced that she had only been gone for a single night. Eventually it's claimed that she recovered from this ordeal and was sent to work at a dressmaking shop in Kington, her life now almost back to normal. Almost, because she could still see the fairies. They would sometimes come into the shop and move things around, even steal things. Afraid that she herself might be accused, she confessed to her employer what was happening. "What do you mean you can see the fairies?" said the dressmaker. "Aren't they invisible?" Mary replied that when in their kingdom, they had rubbed some kind of ointment into her eyes, and from then on she was able to see the fairies, even though they were invisible to most people. One day, she warned the fairies to stop stealing things, and they too were confused that she could see them. But she was careful not to tell them from which eye she could see them, in case they should attempt to blind her. It is said that eventually she put her time in fairyland behind her, and lived a very long and fruitful life, but that no matter how many years passed, she was still never quite the same, following her trip to fairyland. Before even starting, it seemed there was a discrepancy between the earlier and later tale, but thankfully Mrs. Leather seemed to have already done the legwork for me. The story was told to her in the village of Wigmore, and this is where the later retelling places Mary as having lived. But according to Mrs. Leather, their home was actually in the nearby town of Knighton, Wigmore only being the home of the first cousin once removed who told the tale to Mrs. Leather. The two towns probably being confused due to the similar sounding names of Knighton and Kington. This was good, as it would form a starting point in tracking down the real-life Mary. That said, records from this time are often scant, even missing entirely, and so I knew it would be no easy task to find even a whisper of Mary really existing. All I had to go on were Mrs. Leather's notes, and the names given in the later version. This Mrs. W was meaningless, as Mrs. Leather was known to use simple initials to anonymise her contacts. But we do know that she was 75 in 1909, meaning she must have been born around 1834. This meant that her mother, if we assume that she was at least 18 when she had her first child, may have been born around 1816, give or take a number of years. Her cousin then, Mary, was probably born around the same time. At first I couldn't find anything that fit the description, with every record showing dates and locations completely out of sync with the folktale and the places in it. But then I realised that the name Mary Powell came from a later retelling of the tale, and so this was probably her married name, her maiden name being almost certainly lost. Knowing this, I soon discovered this record. A Mary of whom married a James or John Powell in Knighton. Her date of birth around 1819. Exactly in fitting with the folklore timings. Could it really be her? In later life she had a son, with the middle name Childs, and a quick search of this found that the Childs family were living in Wigmore, the location of the elusive Mrs. W from the folklore book, so presumably the cousin connection. But this was not all, as there was something unusual on Mary's record. As well as all of the expected things,
Another note had been scribbled on the right-hand column of the page, in the section put aside for disabilities. She was recorded as number 4 on the list. Lunatic.
I think this might actually be the person from the story. The dates and places all fit. Even that connection to Wigmore. And this lunatic noting, it's strange. Why would they write that? All we know is that Mary was changed by her trip to fairyland, whatever that might have actually been. She said she could see the fairies, that they put some ointment in her eyes. That she never really fully recovered. What would the average person think about that? This note on the record. This is her, I'm sure it is. And we even get to know where she lived. A place called Child's Alley, strangely enough. I don't know if it's any relation to the child in the genealogy tree, but Child's Alley in Knighton. Somewhere to visit later. What really happened to Mary Powell? Let's find out.
Before going to Mary's hometown of Knighton, I would first visit the town with a similar name, Kington, where Mary went to work in the dress shop after coming back from fairyland, and also the closest town to the elusive Dancing Gates, near to where she vanished into the fairy ring. There's a lot of history and folklore in Kington, a small town bordered by the hills separating England from Wales. Kington is like a frontier town, a crossing place between culture, language, and history. The perfect place to track down Mary. I've got a list here of shops in Kington which existed when Kelly's dictionary was written in 1913. It's pretty safe to assume that most of these would have been the same as when Mary worked here. There's only one street in Kington and it had the butchers, saddlers, greengrocers. And here, at number 48 High Street, we can see the ladies and gents tailors and hosiers. Surely the dressmaking shop that she worked at. It's different now. Long since closed by the looks of things. It's still interesting though. This is the first real shadow of Mary. It's easy to imagine this being the old dressmakers. Beautiful dresses and suits in the window. And knowing Mary came in and out of this doorway, telling tales about seeing the fairies inside. It's all forgotten now. But Mary was here, reclaiming her life following that missing year. The shop is quite sad now, all dark and abandoned. Those golden days long lost in time. And look, there's some pictures of butterflies left in the window, almost like fairies in flight. Finding the shop was easy, but what about the Dancing Gates? If I was going to find where Mary disappeared into the fairy ring, I would need to figure out just what these were and where they were located. I started with old Ordnance Survey maps and charts, looking for any villages, lanes or farms which might have had this name associated with them. Nothing came up. But it didn't seem like an impossible task. After all, the Dancing Gates had to be somewhere between Knighton and Kington, where Mary attended the ball, and had to be closer to Kington than they were to her hometown, as the story clearly states that the Dancing Gates were near to Kington. Since nothing was obvious, I quickly assumed that the Dancing Gates were not an official name as such, but some local nickname for a landmark or area of land. Something the locals would have known, but everybody else would have known as something different entirely. After much searching, I finally discovered something of great interest. A stately home had once stood 3 miles north from Kington, the exact type of place where dances and balls would be held, and its name, oddly enough, was Eyewood House. Eye wood, as in the connection with eyes, and fairies putting ointment in them. All big houses like this had a long driveway and gatehouse at their end, often with large and ornate gates. If dances were held there with any regularity, could not the gates in and out, the first and last thing that the revellers would see, be known locally as the gate to the dance, the dancing gates? But then it got even stranger. Near to Eyewood House was the converging point of 2 old drovers' roads, ancient pathways that we would walk on before the modern roads we have today. If you wanted to, and you were fit enough to make the journey, you could probably still walk on most of these paths for the 9 or so miles to the town of Knighton, where Mary lived. I was now sure of it. This had to be the place. Eyewood House, however, was demolished in 1954, leaving only the driveway which once led to its grand exterior. Could there still be anything left of Mary and the dance?
So there is actually something else that's a bit strange about this Eyewood House that I'm going to go and have a look at in a minute. I looked everywhere to find out why it would be called that, and nothing. So there's nothing on the internet, and I've got loads of books like these, Welsh borders, and I've scoured through them all, and there's no family name, there's nothing. But what there was is where those 2 drovers' roads met, there was a glacial lake, so that's something left over from the last ice age, and Eyewood House was built to overlook this lake. And it's an ancient place, and they were always, or at least almost always, sacred places for our ancestors, and because that's such a meeting place of those 2 roads, I would say it's very high chances that that is that type of place. Votive offerings might have been left there. And here's the strange thing, a lot of these places, lakes, springs, wells, they have in folklore a connection with the eyes. Especially wells, but again lakes, the wells were often actually known as eye wells, because people believed that by rubbing them in their eyes, it could heal blindness. It could be something to do with the minerals in the water, some people think. And then, of course, metaphorically, it heals blindness and gives a spiritual sight. So it's that type of thing as well. That, to me, just seems a bit odd to be linking up like that. Mary talks about having the fairies putting ointment in her eyes, or it was in one eye, I think, and then she could see the fairies. It just seems, perhaps, that is the Eyewood House, which means that near this dancing gates, near this lake, that's where all this happened. It's like an embroidery of time, this folklore, different elements of things ancient and medieval and Victorian, and all sort of is weaved together into these tales, and that's what we have to try and unpick. And so I'm going to go to Eyewood House, or where it used to be. Right now it is actually forecast thunderstorms as well for this morning, but it's just a bit grey out there at the moment. Hopefully we miss them, but I'm just still in Kington, so I'm not sure what it's going to be like when we get out there to the woods, but let's go and have a look. Just have to find somewhere to park. Let's have a look down here past the Stag Inn. This looks like it'll do. Alright, so here we are. Eyewood Lane. So that means that just somewhere up here is the road that would have led to Eyewood House. And so if this really was the way in, And way out of the house, then the gates should be up here, the dancing gates. Which also means, of course, that we're quite close by to where Mary's life was going to change forever with that trip to the fairyland. Let's go see what we can find.
And there they were, at the end of the lane, where the driveway to the house used to be. The old gatehouse lodge was still standing, now a private residence, and beside it stood what remained of the gates leading to Iwood House beyond. The gates in and out of the house. The first and last thing one would see when coming and going from the ball. The dancing gates of the folklore story. I've just left the dancing gates, close by at the entrance to old Iwood House, and I'm about to venture onto the pathways here, of which, if I follow them for long enough, would lead high onto the drovers' roads and onwards into the countryside. If everything is correct, then this is almost certainly the way she walked. And that means just one thing. It's also where she vanished. This is, of course, the strangest part of the folk story. But the things that happened are not actually that uncommon in the world of folklore and myth. We often encounter fairies as lovers of song and dance, and they play music and dance around the fairy ring, a type of natural circle of mushrooms, formed by a fungus known as mycelium. If you walk into a fairy ring, according to legend anyway, you'll find yourself whisked away to fairyland, like Mary. This is not the only common theme showing up in the story either. That idea of lost time is something we see repeated in these folk stories. In some of these tales and legends, the protagonist goes into the fairy world for a short time, but when they return their body turns to ash, for hundreds of years have actually passed in our world. We see it also in myths like Turnanog, the land of eternal youth, the likely inspiration for J.M. Barrie's Neverland, a fairy world where people do not grow old or die. Time has stopped for them. Time in fairylands is always in flux, deeply relative. Just like time seems to fly when we're having fun here in the human world, while a boring hour seems to go on forever. The fact that Mary returned thinking only a day had passed links this story with the rich pantheon of fairy tales and stories from all over the world and through all of time. After all, that common phrase, "away with the fairies," literally meant that one was no longer in our world, but had travelled to some fairy kingdom in another realm, where time stood still, and everything was ruled by courts of fae folk with their own peculiar ways of being. But what really happened to her? Am I in danger of vanishing into the fairy world by walking these paths? Or is there another explanation? I've come up with a few possibilities for this, but it's a very strange thing that happened here. It's quite unnerving, really, to think that something of some description did happen to Mary around this area. Otherwise these things would have never been written down in the first place, turned into the myths we read today. So my first possibility is that she suffered some kind of acute mental health episode on her way home from the dance. Did she fall and hit her head? Did she suffer some kind of stroke or other brain injury? Perhaps she had some latent psychosis or other complex issue, of which finally got out of control after the night at the dance. I'm reminded of that word lunatic on her archive record. It makes you think. And again she was away with the fairies, of which, although used to mean literally away in the fairyland, it now of course means somebody kind of out of touch with reality. But then, if this is so, wouldn't she still have wandered home, or at least been found alone in the woods? The search was made in all the paths and roads for an entire year, after all. And she does seem to have recovered as well. To have gotten married, held a job, said to lead a long and normal life. I just don't know. Another option is that she made it all up. Possibly to elope or run away with some lover that she met at the dance at Iwood House. Maybe she thought her mother wouldn't approve, so when she eventually was found, she created some story about being away in the fairyland, instead of merely away with her lover. This might explain why she was sometimes seen, but then disappeared again. She was still around the villages, but quickly dashed away and hid when she realised she'd been spotted. But then she kept the story up for a very long time, and the elements of the tale are fully in keeping with the ancient accounts of such fairy encounters. Why would she insist for so long that she could still see the fairies, even after her life had returned completely to normal? The other option is rather unsettling, to think that something very strange and completely unexplainable really did happen to Mary here on this ancient path, interpreted as fairies by culture and time. The conjoining of two drovers' roads is like what we hear about with energy pathways, and they used to be known as fairy paths. An actual roadway that the fairies travelled upon, invisible to everybody apart from someone like Mary. And I'm reminded of stories like time slips, where people find themselves momentarily out of space and time, only to abruptly jump back into the present. There's a street in Liverpool that's famous for it, Bold Street, in the city centre. Some think that underground trains are disturbing the energies and vibrations, and others are much less conclusive. But some are convinced, even in our modern sceptical age, that it's actually happened to them, for real. These fairy abduction tales are also similar to alien abductions, and I can't help but wondering if Mary's events had happened today, that she would have claimed to have been taken away by aliens instead of fairies. The elements are the same, just coloured in a different costume, retold for a different time, a different culture. Oddly enough, a quick search revealed that this area around Kington was something of a hotbed for UFO and alien sightings. A weird thought when walking in the woods where Mary disappeared. And this is not even to mention the most bizarre of elements. The fairies putting ointment in her eyes, and ever since she was able to see them. Was it just a corruption of Iwood House like I thought earlier, and of the old glacial lake of which I visited close by the path, glistening in the grey skies, with atmosphere both beautiful and yet also cold, sinister even? There were far more weird and wonderful elements to this story than were ever possible to fit together. And the more I thought about them, the more the atmosphere in the woods turned abruptly strange and unwelcoming, inviting one to ponder on strange things and the mysteries of the wilds and the untrodden pathways of ancient drovers' roads where Mary disappeared.
You know, this really does seem like quite a strange woodland. I don't know if it's just the thundery atmosphere or what, but if anywhere was going to be fairy haunted, I think it's this, most definitely. It's very easy in a place like this to think you can see somebody watching you from just off beyond, in the unknown, in the shadows. Or you can see faces in the trees and hear the rustle of animals in the overgrowth. Shadows seem to dance. And, I mean, I'm the only person here today, and strangely enough it really does feel like I'm not entirely alone. There is that feeling in the woodlands. I think a lot of us get that. And the fact it feels like that here in the daytime, imagine what it must have been like at night. When, of course, you wouldn't have an electric flashlight or anything like that. Just moonlight to work your way through these forests. The atmosphere would be very, very heavy indeed. And for people of whom do genuinely believe in the fairies and the elves and the nature spirits, glimpsing at them from behind those ancient trees, it's easy to believe that she would have seen things, insects even, floating and flickering in the moonlight. That said, it is definitely going to thunder or rain very shortly. You can really feel it in the air, so I think it's time to get back to the car and head on to the next destination.
I'd found Mary on the archives, walked in her shadow to the shop in Kington and the dancing gates, followed her footsteps into the woods where her bizarre fate awaited her. There was only one thing left to do: find Mary herself. I travelled to Knighton, her hometown, thankfully in the car instead of some fairy-haunted Drover's Road, and went back to her birthplace, and according to the records, where she eventually died. This of course would also be where she would leave and come home to when she went to the dances, including that fabled dance near Kington, where her life changed with a trip to the fairy world.
It's actually quite strange to be driving along the path that she would have walked on. It might seem like it's a really long distance for us to be walking 9 miles to go to a dance, and then back home again obviously, but that's actually what they used to do. People did used to walk long distances in these early Victorian and pre-Victorian days. There was obviously no transport like we know today, and these drovers' roads would have been walked on by a lot of people. They'd have thought nothing of walking that length of distance for any event that they wanted to go to. I'm just imagining her obviously having some type of rougher boots on to walk there, and then changing into a dancing shoes or whatever she had on when she actually arrived. I can't imagine her sort of plodding through fields in little dancing shoes for 9 miles, but you know, this is what we're doing. We're literally on the trail of Mary Powell, and some of this countryside that I can see, probably apart from the road passing through, hasn't really changed very much since those days.
After lunch, it was time to explore. I had with me some old photos showing Child's Alley, where Mary used to live. Here it is marked out on a map, just off Plough Lane on the junction of Market Street. The only problem is, it's not there anymore. It was all knocked down in the 1930s as part of slum clearance. But I was still going to have a look. Wow, so here we are. This was Child's Alley. And there's really not much here anymore. But this is it. This is from where she left to go to the dance. Came back a year later, thinking only a day had passed. Imagine her mother and family here, wondering where she'd gone. All that searching the fields and paths, with no success. It all happened here. Imagine the stories that were told. It actually feels quite weird. Like this sad old place is somehow haunted by Mary. It seems the only original building still standing is here on the corner of the alley. This pub and coaching inn, the Plough. Could Mary and her family have visited here? Maybe even told tales inside of the fairy world to whoever was willing to listen. Child's Alley was strange to visit, but there was nothing there in remembrance of Mary, and neither was there at this strange place on the old map. Conjurer's Hut, possibly the location of the wise man, and only around the corner from Child's Alley. But what I really wanted to find, if such a thing was even possible, was Mary's grave. I started with the local church, where it's safe to assume she attended when she was married, and again when, allegedly at over 100 years old, she finally died, and her fairy adventures were all over, soon to be forgotten, if it wasn't for the likes of Mrs. Leather keeping it all alive. If Mary walked on these old church aisles, I wonder if she could see the fairies here, too. Finding Mary to begin with was no simple task, and finding her grave was going to be harder still. It was a big cemetery, and many of the older graves had faded away completely, or even been removed, likely deemed a safety risk. Was this really going to be possible? After a long time of searching, something caught my eye. A solitary stone with no others around it, almost entirely faded with the passage of time. But the name stood out to me. It was her. This is Mary, who married John Powell, lived in Knighton, and died a centenarian. This was also our Mary of the fairies, a real-life survivor of some great unknown, taken to the grave with her. Here she lies, motionless in the dust of the earth, but still able to tell us about her trip to fairyland, thanks to Mrs. Leather and those old folklore books. Unfortunately, I could barely read the epitaph, being only able to make out a few words. But I managed to put what few words I could read into my phone, and was able to figure out that it was the last 3 stanzas of O God, Our Help in Ages Past, a hymn of which paraphrases the 90th Psalm. 1,000 ages in thy sight are like an evening gone, short as the watch that ends the night before the rising sun. Time, like an ever-rolling stream, bears all its suns away. They fly forgotten as a dream dies at the opening day. O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, be thou our guard while life shall last, and our eternal home. If there was something of the fairy world on Mary's grave, it was that. Those first lines of the epitaph. 1,000 ages in thy sight are like an evening gone. Just like Mary was gone for a year, but thought that only a day had passed. I do wonder, I really do, whether this is why that hymn was chosen. A double meaning, literally talking about her time spent with the fairies. If so, then it really brings it all home to me. She believed what happened to her, and so did her family, enough so to chisel it onto her very grave. Mary's fairy world is lost, but she is now found, and you can remember her too, in whatever way you choose to do. Was she, like the record said, a lunatic literally away with the fairies? Or was she a mother, a wife, and a survivor of something so strange, so outside of our ability to reason with, that the only way to explain it is through stories and fables? The next time you go to a dance and hear beautiful music echoing into the night, remember Mary.